to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Seasons of life. That is what we are talking about today. So welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast. My name is Tracy Austin, and formerly Tracy Shirk, and I am the Chief Talent Officer here at Elevated Talent Consulting. And I am joined today by the fantastic Shari Simpson, who is host of HR Mixtape and one of the key leaders at Paylocity. So Shari, welcome to the show.
Tracy, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be a great discussion.
It is. So, seasons of life and how this impacts HR.
There is so much that comes to mind when I think of this. I mean, I think about my own career and every place I've been, and that's had a huge impact on my career, let alone how I think about working with employees.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So before we dive in super deep, one of the things I just kind of want to chat about is so often we're talking about how do we optimize talent inside of our organization? And there's 4 key levers that we look at. For our listeners that follow Predictive Index, this is going to be super familiar. And the 5th one that I always throw in is seasons of life. So the 4 are fit to role. What is your leader managing you the way you need to be led, the culture of the organization as aligned to your personal values, and then looking at the team. Are we turning up the strengths of the individuals on our team as aligned to the strategy of the team? And of course, the 5th one is the season of life we're in. And what gets missed so often is the season of life we're in can have a huge impact on work. And so, Shari, what I'd love to talk about today is how do we move through seasons of life, both as the employer looking at this saying, hey, we want to optimize our staff, but there's seasons of life where you cannot be optimized and you can't optimize that organization through that. And then there's others where it's like, you're on fire, right? And then the flip side of that is, for the employee, how do we create space and place and trust to really be able to name seasons so that we can work together through those?
Well, for our listeners, I was telling Tracy in advance that our conversation on this topic could not come at a better time in my season of life. So those that do follow my podcast know that I have 3 active duty military sons. And the youngest just went to boot camp 2 weeks ago as of this recording date. And so I've gone from a house full of boys and sports to being an empty nester. And I will tell you, I'm pretty young. I'm 43. So being an empty nester at 43 is pretty young. And we're just going through things, me and my husband, trying to figure out what our evenings look like and what does our flow of work look like? And how do I think about this great flexibility that I have working remote? Was really great when I had kids at home. And do I need that flexibility now? Should I be in the office more? There's a lot that I'm just considering as we go into this conversation.
And I love it. And I love all the things we're looking at. And for our listeners, which many of you don't know, other than my name changed at the beginning of this, is my divorce was finalized a couple of weeks ago. And so there's a huge season of life of what happens with that and what, the 10 months prior to this point in time and what that looks like. So let's dig into it. What are some things that we can look at from the employer side of this?
Well, I think definitely we need to think about our policies and our practices that we have in place for different seasons of life. So, in your scenario, you're thinking about name change, right? And there's a whole list of things we have to think about from an HR perspective as to how that name change gets distributed throughout our systems, how we talk about it to other employees, how we maybe support that employee as they go through this season of life and the name change and how that's going to get communicated out. Does the employee want to keep the name internally and the email internally, but, externally in their personal life, they're going to make changes. Those are all things we have to think about. I think about, the front end, right? Getting married, some of the same kinds of things you have to think about. But also think about, having your first child, going through a life event, as we like to call it in the benefit space, right? What does that look like? And what are all the things that you have to think about? And I'm not talking about just beyond, hey, we opened up a life event for you to select your benefits. I mean, things like, hey, I'm coming back to work as a nursing mom. How do I handle that? Oh, hey, me and my spouse both work at the company. How do we handle leave of absence? What's covered under FMLA? What's covered underneath our policy? How is my manager going to support me? What's the culture being created in my team as a female? What am I going to come back to? Will I have a supervisor who has or has not had kids in the past to know all those different things? I mean, those are a few that just come up at the top of my head, things I've experienced in my life.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other side of this is you just talked about the very tactical pieces of the impact of season of life, right? Like, how do we get this through our system? What are all the legal boxes that we need to check? And on the flip side of that, I love how you just talked about where's the human side of this? Where's the conversation of how we're truly supporting each other as humans in a work environment to, do their best work and know, hey, I've got support here. No matter what's happening, I know that it is my responsibility to show up. I know it's my and I don't just mean physically, I mean actually do work, right? like that is my responsibility. But there's all sorts of things. Like you're seeing things now where you're like, oh man, this environment at home doesn't feel the same, right? And I'm looking at through divorce, there are so many meetings and things that need to get sent in and this and that and whatever else that truly pull you away from the day to day. So how do we create that human support network in a way that the organization culture provides that trust without, having some ramifications on top of the ramifications that are already happening?
Yeah, I think you have to start with empathy. I think any business that leans into empathy as one of their core values is going to be more successful compared to a business who doesn't. And empathy really means understanding and showing up for the person in the way that they want you to show up for them. So, it's funny, we talk about the golden rule and it's, do unto others what you want done to you. And I don't know what the flip side of that expression is or the formal term of it, but like, do unto them what they want done to them, I feel like is a way better use of that phrase because, for me, I don't want my boss to bring up the fact that I'm an empty nester every day. I don't want her to check in with me like that. I'm a really independent person. I want her to acknowledge it and have conversations in ancillary of it. So, for example, we had a really great conversation of all this time I have now where she approached it from the perspective of, don't take that time and put all your discretionary effort now into work. Find a hobby, find something that's going to fill your cup outside of work because for so long you've had this avenue, your children that was filling your cup. So where else can you fill your cup? So I think we got to start with empathy. The next thing is if you have ERGs in your organization, if you have...
I just want to pause and say employee resource groups.
Yes.
I love just making sure we're pulling it in. Okay, keep going.
Yes, I was going to elaborate, but you got to before me. If you have employee affinity groups, sometimes they're called a lot of different things. Those are a great place to build up resources for those going through different seasons of life, depending upon what type of employee resource groups you have. So if you have a women's employee resource group, there's a lot that can come with that. If you have a LGBTQIAP plus ERG group, there's a lot of things that could come in the season of life in that population, right? Maybe somebody's going through transition. Maybe somebody's just coming out for the first time. There's just so much to think about. And I think this ties into just how we think about culture and employee experience, right? It no longer becomes this word or this idea. It's where the rubber meets the road and how we show up for employees, how we talk to them, how we show empathy, how we create resources that are helpful to them and not exclude people. So I think sometimes when we talk about these seasons of life, there's these big markers that we think about like parents and those kinds of things, but there's so many other seasons of life that affect all sorts of employees that you have to be open yourself as an HR person to have a better understanding of what those might be if they're especially things that you're not going to experience.
Absolutely. And I think let's chat about a couple of those other seasons of life, right? I think one of those is, when you have kids, we talked about having kids. So that's clearly one. But when they transition into school for the first time into kindergarten, that's a big one. The transition into high school, the transition out of high school, the transition sometimes a kiddo getting a driver's license. That is like amazing. Like, oh my gosh, freedom. Like, yes, please. And then there's, hey, I'm going back to school, to get a master's degree. There's a spouse is going back to school. There's a spouse deployed. There is somebody starts traveling or that changes. You have parents, being ill or becoming the caregiver for a parent. You have parents passing away. These are all key seasons. What am I missing?
Oh man, moving. I think moving is a season of life. It doesn't matter
it's a huge season.
where you're at. Moving definitely. I think about, as retirement. I mean, I know that like usually retirement means you're leaving an organization, but it might not necessarily mean that. It might mean you've come to the realization that working 40 hours a week isn't serving you, mentally and physically, but you don't want to not work, right? So that season of life, how do you think about that? I think for those that have decided not to have children, and I think this is a topic we don't talk about enough, is that we focus too much on parents and not larger population. There's a lot of things that single people or people who choose not to not have kids, they have a whole different set of seasons of life things. They have different flexibility and different constraints than other employees do. And so being cognizant of that, a big season of life that I'm thinking about is taking care of older parents as they get older. How is that going to impact my ability to work and to show up in the way I want to, especially because I have siblings in different states, right? So now you're having not only a season of life conversation with work, but like, how do we manage maybe something financially, maybe, time, maybe all those things. It's just a lot to consider.
Absolutely. So I want to shift the conversation here a little bit into, we're both HR professionals. We both serve a significant number of folks. And yes, we want to have empathy with seasons of life, but yet the work needs to get done. And so how do we create those policies, those structures with grace to ensure that we're supporting our staff when there's, some season that is clearly an off season for this individual, where they don't have to add the additional pressure of fear of their job on top of what's already happening?
Yeah, I think COVID was a really good testing ground for these concepts. And what I mean by that is we had so many organizations, we had so many managers who looked at being in the office as productivity. Those two things were equal, right? I can walk past your desk. I can see you're working. Therefore, you're getting stuff done. And I talk about this when I present at conferences. I say, let's be real. We all know how to switch our screens super fast so that our boss can't see what we're working on. We learned that right when we came to corporate America. So that's a terrible marker of, is the work getting done? It's this idea of moving to results-oriented work, which is not a new concept. It's been around for a long time. But how do we talk about expectations and how do we measure the work that people are doing so that we have really clear boundaries as to, what needs to get done, what we can push off? The other thing is managers have to be able to help their employees prioritize during these seasons of life, because some employees will take on everything. They won't talk about what's going on in their lives, and things will start to fall through the cracks. So we have responsibility in that, where we could show up and we could get punitive, we could do write-ups, we could talk about performance improvement plans, or we could have a conversation that says, what's going on? A, and then B, let me help you prioritize. And C, these are the things that have to get done. And just be very honest and transparent is, if you can't meet these expectations, we do have to have another conversation. But you can have that with grace and empathy and not be punitive and not make somebody feel like the season they are in life that they're going to get punished for.
Right. Absolutely. And just having that conversation and building that level of trust really increases their engagement, the employee's engagement, not only in you as their leader, but also in the organization. And that is so key throughout, how do we create great work environments? We build trust, and we build trust by knowing the human that is doing the work and the humans that are doing the work. And we really build strong teams where we're turning up strengths and we're saying, I gotcha. Because I know when I need it, you're going to have me.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is there's an opportunity for us to teach ourselves about these moments before they happen. I think about that a lot when I'm talking to women in our ERG. So I'm a co-leader for our women's ERG. It's called Sheroes. I think it's absolutely a fantastic name for an ERG. And it was interesting because our committee heads are made up of mostly women who are married with children. And I noticed in one of our meetings that we were spending a lot of time talking about our kids. And I was watching the one woman in our committee who doesn't have kids, who has chosen not to have kids, doesn't want them, doesn't have any ambition in that area. And I was like, wow, I don't know what that must feel like to sit in a room with women who all we're doing is talking about our kids. Like that must feel alienating. It must feel, these types of things. I think we got to be really curious about those moments of life and think about what it must feel like to be in those moments so that we can show up in the best way. Nothing surprises me more than when a parent comes back from maternity or paternity leave and a supervisor just expects them to jump back into work 100%. Like it's really hard to leave family and come back to work, whether it's, new babies or maybe you're a caretaker for an elderly parent. Like it's hard to make that transition. And so being open to understanding what that feels like, I think will make us better leaders and have better conversations about expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as we kind of start to transition here and land this conversation, what I'm really curious about is for our listeners that are listening to this going, okay, I'm going through a season of life. How do I create the space and the place and the conversation so I can take care of myself and ensure that I'm truly being, that great employee inside of my organization?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I think it's something that we struggle with in HR, setting boundaries. Like, let's be real. A lot of times we start our careers and we think about, I need to be accessible. I need to show up. I need to carry my work phone with me no matter what, because if something goes down, they have to get a hold of me. That might be true to some extent, but it usually isn't. And usually emergencies can wait till Monday. I mean, that's the reality. So I think that we got to be really clear about setting boundaries. And as an employee who's going through a season in life, I think it's good for you to have a boundaries conversation and talk about, what you think you can and cannot do. What is the expectation going to be in your response to emails, right? Do you have an organization where it's the same day you get an email, you have to respond 24 hours, 48 hours? Maybe there's no expectation, but that's probably something you want to define with your supervisor as you go into the season life or as you find yourself in a season life. The second thing is set boundaries around your time. Maybe there is an hour that you need every day, right? With whatever you're going through. You'd mentioned going through divorce and all the paperwork and all the meetings and all the things that you had to do, being able to have that conversation and say like, hey, I'm still going to meet the expectations of my role, but I do need some flexibility here. So I think having that conversation. And then, the third thing is don't leave your supervisor in the dark. Don't let them have to guess what's happening. And I'm not saying divulge your whole life, because some people are very private and they don't want their supervisor knowing everything, but you do have to communicate a certain amount so that you don't end up in a situation where your supervisor has no idea. They're seeing a dip in your performance, and then they're going to go down that road of a performance improvement plan or a bad review or some feedback you just don't know you were going to get because honestly, you were just trying to make it through life. You were just trying to get through every day,
Right.
But those are hard. I mean, those are hard conversations. I would say if the other thing is tap into the resources you have available. So this might be a great opportunity for you to use one of those sessions through EAP to talk about, hey, how do I navigate this season of life? And what are some things I'm not thinking of?
Absolutely. And I had a mentor of mine say to me, I said, I'm just hanging on by a thread, like trauma, right?
Yeah.
And her response was, sometimes all you need is a thread to hang on to.
I feel that because that first few days after my youngest went to boot camp, it was literally like anything was very sensitive to me. Yeah. I came home And the car that he typically drove was at the end of the driveway. And my very first thought was like, oh, my son's home. And the very next thought was, my son isn't home and he's never coming home and he's moved away forever, right? There's like all that negative talk starts,
Yeah.
It's something as simple as a car being at the end of the driveway. Now it's affected my mood, which, I mean, fortunately, it was the weekend. I wasn't heading into a meeting, but think about if my next meeting had been with the C-suite or my next meeting had been with a direct reporter or all of those things, we need to practice mindfulness.
Absolutely. Sure. And let's just throw out a tip here. Do not schedule a meeting right after a mediation session or a session with your attorney. Like, please don't do that.
It's probably not good for anybody.
Says the person that stacked her calendar completely full. Like, don't do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, so Shari, I'm curious, what is a key takeaway that you have for executives listening into our conversation today?
Oh, I think my key takeaway from them is build empathy into your culture. Make sure that your senior leadership team knows that empathy is okay. Make sure that they know that while you have policies in place, that flexibility is okay and that you can show grace in certain situations. Don't create an environment that's so rigid that your employees don't feel safe to speak up and say they're having a season of life and say they need help.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's a takeaway that you have for HR professionals listening in today? A loaded question.
It's such a loaded question. My takeaway for HR professionals is make sure that your policies, like your actual policies that you have in your organization, don't hinder the ability to address seasons of life. And the other thing I would say is make sure that the support mechanisms you have in place are really clear and accessible for your employees. So if you have an EAP, do your employees know how to get to it? Do your employees know what's actually being offered through that EAP? If you have employee resource groups or affinity groups, do the majority of your employees know it? Are you highlighting the work that's being done so that employees know where to go when they need help? And then the last thing is equip your business partners, your coordinators, your generalists, those that are kind of in your front lines with your employees, the right talking points to help employees navigate these potentially tough conversations with their supervisors about the season of life that they're in and the support that they might need.
Absolutely. Well, Shari, as always, thank you so much for being on our show. And we will link HR Mixtape in our show notes, but do you want to chat about it for a sec?
Oh my gosh, of course I want to chat about the HR Mixtape. It is a passion of mine. It is a podcast kind of similar to yours where I get to interview industry experts, but we're doing a lot of fun stuff this time around with content. So we're doing things like answering tough HR questions on Reddit, or I was just at Sherman. We actually had HR professionals come up and submit questions. So those will be featured on an upcoming episode. So a lot of fun stuff happening at the HR Mixtape, and you can find it on all the major podcast players. So no excuses not to subscribe.
Awesome. And speaking of that, please be sure that you subscribe to Talent Optimization, and we will have that out there for you in our show notes as well. So we hope you have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.